She did not know the man's name, the man who had bought her, the man whose bed she now sat upon, a throne of humiliation carved from raw pine and stuffed with coarse ticking. The dress she wore was not her own. It was a borrowed thing, gray as dishwater, the fabric scratching at her neck and wrists. It smelled of lye soap and long storage in a dark chest. Outside, the world was a riot of noise, the drunken cheers of men who had witnessed the transaction, their laughter rattling the thin glass of the window pane like thrown gravel. This room was the eye of the storm, a pocket of dreadful silence where she was the only object. Her hands lay in her lap, fingers laced together so tightly the knuckles were white mountains in a landscape of chapped skin. She focused on them, on the half-moons of dirt beneath her nails, a souvenir from the long road that had ended here. She had been told to wait. Waiting was something she knew how to do. She had waited in dusty yards and on the cold steps of churches, waited for a wagon, for a meal, for a new master. Waiting was a kind of breathing. You just did it until you didn't have to anymore. The door opened with a sudden, splintering sound, and he was there. Jedediah. That was his name. He filled the doorway, a man built of broad planks and raw confidence, his face flushed with whiskey and victory. He grinned, a flash of white teeth in a sun-browned face. He looked at her not as a man looks at a woman, but as a farmer looks at a newly acquired piece of livestock. His gaze roamed over her, assessing, possessive. It stripped the borrowed dress from her skin, peeled back the layers of silence until all that was left was the quivering, nameless thing at her core. "Well now," he said, his voice thick and jovial, a sound that slid over her skin like grease. "Not much of a talker, are you?" She said nothing. She kept her eyes on her own hands. To look up would be to give him something, a piece of herself he had not paid for. He strode into the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He stopped before the bed, looming. The smell of him, sweat, cheap liquor, and the cloying scent of bay rum, filled the small space, choking the air. He was a walking storm, and she was just a sapling in his path. "Paid a good price," he went on, more to himself than to her. "Father said I was a fool, but I like him quiet." He reached out a hand, a thick-fingered, careless hand, and touched a strand of her hair. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement, a muscle twitching in her shoulder. His grin widened. He liked that, too. He liked the fear. It was part of the purchase. Downstairs, a fiddle struck up a ragged, wheezing tune. Someone howled with laughter. The sounds were a world away. Here, there was only his breathing and the frantic, bird-wing beat of her own heart against her ribs. It was then that another man appeared in the doorway. He did not enter the room but stood on the threshold, a silhouette against the brighter light of the hallway. He was leaner than Jedediah, built of wire and shadow, not planks and bluster. He wore a dusty coat that seemed to carry the scent of the open plains, of long miles and cold nights. He did not speak. He just watched. Jedediah turned, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Elias? Can't you see I'm occupied?" The man, Elias, stepped just inside the room. His face was weathered, carved by wind and sun and something deeper, something that looked like sorrow. He carried whole winters in his eyes. They were gray and quiet and missed nothing. His gaze flicked to her for a fraction of a second, not with the possessive heat of Jedediah's, but with a flat, unreadable assessment. Then his eyes settled back on the larger man. "I'll take her," Elias said. His voice was low and raspy, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. It was not a request. Jedediah threw his head back and laughed, a loud, barking sound. "You'll what? You're drunker than I am. She's my wife. The preacher said the words not an hour ago." "The debt your father owes me," Elias said, his tone unchanging. "The one for the seed and the 2 good maras. Cancel it, and I'll take her off your hands." The grin slid from Jedediah's face. He stared at Elias, his brow furrowed in disbelief, then dawning comprehension. The debt was significant, a weight that had hung over his family's farm for 2 seasons. It was a famous debt, a source of gossip in the territory. To have it wiped clean. For this? For a silent, half-starved girl. Why? Jedediah asked, his voice now a suspicious whisper. What's she to you? Elias's gaze was steady. I need a hand at my place. My roof leaks. She looks like she can hold a bucket. The explanation was so plain, so devoid of romance or desire, that it was strangely believable. It was a transaction of practicality. Jedediah looked from Elias's stoic face to the girl on the bed. He saw an object of his pride, a symbol of his status. Then he thought of the debt, of his father's constant, grating worry. His own pride warred with a deeper, more pragmatic greed. He could always find another woman. A debt like that was a yoke. And $50 coin, Jedediah added, his voice regaining some of its swagger. For my trouble. For the insult. Elias reached into his coat without a word. He pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with the dull clink of metal. He tossed it onto the bed. It landed softly on the quilt beside her thigh. The sound was a final, damning gavel. Jedediah grunted, satisfied. He gave her one last, lingering look, a mixture of contempt and relief. She's all yours, then. Don't come crying to me when you find she's got no tongue in her head. He turned and shouldered his way past Elias, stomping down the stairs to rejoin the celebration of a wedding that was already over. The room fell silent again. But this silence was different. The air had changed. The suffocating pressure had lifted. Elias remained by the door, not moving closer. He waited, giving the space back to her, letting her breathe in the new reality. She did not move. She was a stone statue, frozen in a moment of disbelief. She had been bought and sold twice in the space of an hour. Finally, he moved. He walked slowly toward the bed, his worn boots making almost no sound on the floorboards. She tensed, her hands clenching again in her lap. She expected him to speak, to give an order, to claim his purchase. But he did not. He stopped a few feet away and knelt. The movement was slow, deliberate, the creak of his knees loud in the quiet room. He did not look at her face. His gaze fell to her feet. They were still clad in the dusty, broken shoes she had worn on her long journey to this place. The leather cracked and the laces frayed ropes of dirt. They were the shoes of a wanderer, not a bride. He reached out, his hands calloused and steady, and gently took hold of one of her feet. His touch was light, impersonal, the way a blacksmith might handle a horseshoe. With quiet, methodical movements, he began to unpick the knot in the lace. His fingers worked patiently at the grime-stiffened knot. Took a long moment. When it finally came free, he carefully unwound the lace from the eyelets and slipped the ruined shoe from her foot. He set it softly on the floor. Then he did the same with the other one. When he was done, he remained kneeling for a moment, looking at her bare, dust-smudged feet. It was an act of profound and unspoken kindness. He had not freed her from the room, not yet. But he had untied her from the journey that had brought her to this degradation. He had released her. He rose to his feet, just as quietly as he had knelt. Come on, he said, his voice still low and rough. We're leaving. The journey to his homestead was a long walk into emptiness. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they were leaving behind. The town shrank and then vanished, swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. The land was shades of brown and pale yellow, cracked earth and tough, wiry grass that bent low in the ceaseless wind. The wind was a constant companion, whispering of loneliness, scouring the landscape clean. Elias walked a few paces ahead of her, setting a slow, steady rhythm. He did not look back to see if she was following. He seemed to trust that she would, that she had no other choice. And she did. She walked in his footsteps, her bare feet tender on the hard-packed ground. The sharp edges of pebbles were a new kind of pain, an honest one that rooted her in the here and now, away from the suffocating room with the pine bed. After an hour, he stopped. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and drank, then held it out to her. She hesitated for a heartbeat before taking it. The metal was cool against her palms. The water was lukewarm and tasted of tin. But it was the first thing she had been given that was not part of a bargain. It was just water. She drank, then handed it back. Their fingers did not touch. They did not speak. The silence stretched between them, as wide and open as the sky above. It was not an angry silence, nor an awkward one. It was a fallow field, a space left empty, waiting. In that silence, she could feel the hard knot of terror in her chest begin to loosen its grip, fraying at the edges. It was nearly dusk when she saw it. A shape on the horizon, low and dark against the blood-orange smear of the setting sun. A cabin. As they drew closer, she saw it was as weathered and solitary as the man who led her to it. The wood was silvered by sun and scoured by wind, the roof patched in several places. It did not look like a home. It looked like a temporary shelter against a long storm. A single, stark wooden marker stood on a small rise a few dozen yards from the cabin.
Agrave.
No name was carved into it, just a single date. The wind soughed around it, a mournful, unending sigh. Elias's gaze drifted to it for a moment as they passed, and a shadow crossed his face, deep and familiar. He pushed open the cabin door. It swung inward with a low groan. The inside was one room, clean but stark. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, a bed built into one corner. A small curtain of faded calico partitioned off another small area. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dust. The place was hollow. It held its breath, as if waiting for someone who was never coming back. Elias walked to the hearth and began laying a fire, his movements economical and practiced. He did not tell her what to do. He went about his own tasks, leaving her to stand in the middle of the floor, a piece of driftwood washed up on a strange shore. After the fire was lit and crackling, casting dancing shadows on the walls, he gestured toward the calico curtain. "That's your space," he said. She pulled the curtain aside. Behind it was a narrow cot, a thin mattress stuffed with straw, and a single, neatly folded wool blanket at its foot. It was small and bare, but it was separate. It was a promise. He set a bowl of water and a clean, worn rag on the table. Then he took a loaf of bread from a tin box, cut off a thick slice, and put it on a plate next to the water. He pushed the stool out for her. An offering. He did not watch her eat. He turned his back and stood staring into the fire, giving her privacy in the shared space. Later, as she lay on the cot, curled beneath the scratchy wool blanket, she listened to the sounds of the house. The pop and hiss of the fire, the moan of the wind outside, the soft creak of the floorboards as Elias moved about before settling into his own bed. She stared into the darkness behind the curtain and knew, for the first time in a long time, that the door was not locked. The days settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in pale watercolors. The sun set, bleeding crimson and gold across the west. In between, there was work. Elias rose before dawn, his movements spare and silent. He would be gone for hours, tending to the few acres of corn he fought to grow from the stubborn earth, or mending the endless lines of wire fence that stretched out into the prairie. He worked with a grim determination, as if pitting himself against the land itself. She began to inhabit the small spaces he left empty. At first, it was just the cabin. She swept the packed earth floor with a broom made of bundled twigs. She scrubbed the single pot and the 2 plates until they shone. She learned the landscape of the room. The crack in the stone hearth that looked like a lightning bolt, the way the morning sun hit a particular spot on the floor, illuminating a galaxy of dust motes. Slowly, her world expanded. She started tending a small patch of earth near the cabin door, coaxing hardy greens and stubborn root vegetables from the soil. The work was grounding. Her hands, calloused and strong, felt like her own again. She learned the language of the place, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of a snake in the dry grass, the particular way the wind sounded before a storm. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a tapestry woven from silence and action. He would leave a bucket of fresh water by the door in the morning. She would leave a plate of warm food on the table in the evening. Her cooking was simple: stew, cornbread, roasted vegetables. One evening, he finished his meal and looked at the last piece of cornbread on his plate. "A little dry," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She looked at him, startled. It was the first opinion he had offered on anything she had done. She felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. "You didn't complain about mine," he added, a flicker of something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth for a bare second before vanishing. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded and took his plate. But something had shifted. A small stone had been dropped into the still pool of their silence. One afternoon, while weeding her small garden, she noticed a single, resilient yellow wildflower growing near the fence line. On impulse, she picked it. She walked over to the small rise, to the unnamed grave. She hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but the bare wood of the marker looked so lonely. She gently pushed the stem of the flower into the earth at its base, a small offering of color in a world of brown and gray. She did not know if he noticed. He said nothing, but the next evening, a thick woolen shawl, much finer than her own worn wrap, was draped over the back of the stool where she sat. It was old, smelling faintly of lavender and disuse. Sarah's, she thought. He had given her something that belonged to his wife. It was a gesture of trust so profound it made her ache. She wrapped it around her shoulders. The wool was soft against her skin, felt like a shield. The land tested them. A late frost threatened the corn, and they worked side by side through the night, lighting small, smoky fires between the rows to keep the cold at bay. They moved in the flickering firelight as a single entity, their shared purpose a silent bond. His face, illuminated by the orange glow, was stripped of its usual stoicism, showing only exhaustion and a fierce will to endure. A summer storm rolled in one night, a violent, terrifying thing. Lightning split the sky, followed by cracks of thunder that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Rain lashed against the roof and walls. She was pulled from a shallow sleep by a dream of being locked in a dark room, the sound of men's laughter outside the door. She sat bolt upright on her cot, her heart hammering, the thin calico curtain offering no protection from the memory. She heard a sound, a cry, and realized with a jolt of shame that it had come from her own throat. Silence. The storm raged on. Then, she heard the soft scuff of his boots on the floor outside her curtain. He didn't speak. He didn't pull the curtain aside. He just stood there. His presence was a solid, comforting weight in the tumultuous dark. He was standing guard, not over his property, but over her fear. She took a shaky breath. "Don't," she whispered, her voice thin as a thread. "Don't lock me in." The floorboards creaked as he shifted his weight. A long moment passed, filled only by the roar of the wind. "Never," he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the storm, but it was a vow. She lay back down, pulling Sarah's shawl tightly around her. She listened to the sound of his steady presence on the other side of the curtain until the storm passed and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next evening, they sat by the fire, the cabin quiet and still after the storm. The air was washed clean. He was mending a piece of tack, his fingers nimble and sure. She was darning one of his shirts, the needle moving in and out of the rough fabric. The domesticity of the scene was so normal it was jarring. "Why?" she asked, the word dropping into the silence. It was the question she had carried since that first day. He stopped his work, but he did not look at her. He stared into the flames, his profile etched by the firelight. The winters in his eyes seemed to deepen. "My wife," he began, his voice rough. "Sarah." She was gentle. The world was too sharp for her. Too loud. He paused, and she could hear the effort it took for him to shape the words. "I saw you in that room, and I saw them. Men like Jedediah. They take and they take until there's nothing left. I couldn't watch it happen again." He had not rescued her out of pity or charity. He had done it as an act of penance, a desperate attempt to right a past wrong he had been powerless to prevent. He was trying to save his own soul, and in doing so, he had offered her a chance to find hers. She understood, then, that they were both ghosts, haunting the same patch of lonely ground, trying to learn how to live again. The peace was a fragile thing, a skim of ice over deep water. It was broken by the sight of 3 riders on the northern ridge, their forms dark specks against the pale morning sky. They were not neighbors. Neighbors kept to the low road. These men sat their horses on high ground, surveying the small homestead like wolves assessing a fold. Elias saw them too. He was standing by the water pump, his hand frozen on the handle. He watched them for a long, silent moment. His body went still, a tension coiling in his shoulders and back. He did not have to say who they were. She knew. The past had a long memory and a heavy tread. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, her hand gripping the rough wood of the frame. The small, safe world they had built, the garden, the quiet meals, the unspoken promises, suddenly felt flimsy, a house of cards in a rising wind. The wind itself seemed to turn mean, carrying a threat on its currents. The land that had become a sanctuary was now a battleground. The riders made their way down the slope, slowly, deliberately. There was an arrogance in their pace. They were in no hurry. They knew the cabin was an island in a sea of empty prairie. There was nowhere to run. As they drew closer, she recognized the man in the lead. Jedediah. He was dressed more finely than before, in a new coat and hat, as if to underscore his authority. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their faces hard and indifferent. They were here for a job. Elias did not move from the pump. He waited. He finished filling his bucket, his movements unhurried, almost defiant in their normality. He set the bucket down and turned to face them as they rode into the yard, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that settled on everything, coating the green leaves of her garden in a layer of grime. Jedediah reined in his horse a few feet from Elias. He looked around, a sneer twisting his lips as he took in the small, hardscrabble farm. "This is it?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is what you traded a fortune for? A dirt patch and a shack." Elias said nothing. His silence was a wall. Jedediah's gaze shifted and found her in the doorway. His eyes narrowed. He looked her up and down, taking in the clean but patched dress, the way she stood straighter, the shawl of a dead woman wrapped around her shoulders. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by something he didn't recognize. It infuriated him. "The deal is off," Jedediah announced, his voice loud and carrying in the still air. "My father was a fool to agree. She's my wife. The law says so. The church says so. I've come to collect my property." Property. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. It was a brand, meant to sear her back into the shape of the voiceless object she had once been. She felt a cold dread, but beneath it, something else stirred. A hot, slow-burning ember of rage. Elias finally spoke, his voice as quiet and unyielding as the rock beneath their feet. "She's not your property." "The hell she ain't," Jedediah spat, swinging down from his horse. His men dismounted behind him, flanking him. "I have a paper, signed by the preacher. She belongs to me." He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the bridle of his own horse as if he meant to tie her to it and drag her away. Elias moved then. He didn't rush. He simply walked from the pump to the cabin porch, placing himself between Jedediah and the door. He stood on the bottom step, a small elevation that somehow made him seem taller. He was not a big man, not like Jedediah, but he held a stillness that was more formidable than bulk. "She's not going with you," Elias said. Jedediah's face turned purple with rage. "You think you can stop me? You and what army?" He laughed, a humorless sound. "There's no one out here to hear you scream, old man." He was wrong. The cabin door creaked open wider. She stepped out of the shadows and onto the porch, to stand beside Elias. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs, but her feet were steady on the wooden planks. In her hand, She held the small, heavy iron skillet from the hearth. She didn't raise it as a weapon. She just held it. Its weight was a comfort, a solid piece of her new life. Her presence changed the geometry of the confrontation. It was no longer one man against three. It was a unified front. Her standing there was a choice. It was an answer. Jedediah stared at her, his jaw slack with surprise. He had expected her to be cowering inside. He had expected her to be a prize to be fought over. He had not expected her to be a participant. "Get back in the house, woman," he snarled, trying to reassert his dominance. She did not move. She met his gaze directly, and for the first time she spoke to him. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tense air with absolute clarity.
No.
The word, so small, so simple, struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a rejection of everything he stood for. It was the voice of a person, not property. Humiliation washed over his face. He had been defied by his wife in front of his men. His authority was a sham. With a roar of pure fury, he lunged for the porch. "I'll teach you to." Elias moved to block him, raising an arm. But he didn't need to. She stepped forward. As Jedediah reached the edge of the porch, she swung the iron skillet. Not with the flat of it, but with a sharp, precise movement of her wrist, bringing the heavy rim of it cracking against the back of his outstretched hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone. Jedediah screamed. A high, thin sound of shock and agony, stumbling back and clutching his shattered hand to his chest. His men looked on, stunned into inaction. The scene had tilted into something they were not prepared for, something they were not being paid enough to handle. At that moment, two riders appeared on the ridge, the same one where Jedediah's party had first appeared. It was their closest neighbor, a man named Marcus, and his son. They had likely been drawn by the sight of Jedediah's posse. They just sat their horses, watching, their rifles held loosely across their saddles. They weren't taking a side, but their presence was a statement. The world was watching. Jedediah was no longer in the empty wilderness. He was in a community, and he had been bested. Defeated, cradling his broken hand, Jedediah stared at her with eyes full of venomous hatred. Then he turned and clumsily mounted his horse, his face a mask of pain and shame. His men, looking relieved to be leaving, followed suit. "This isn't over," Jedediah hissed, but the threat was hollow. It was the whine of a dog that had been kicked. He turned his horse and rode away, his men trailing behind him, leaving a pall of dust to settle in the silent yard. They were gone. She stood on the porch, the iron skillet still heavy in her hand. Her knuckles were white. A tremor ran through her arms, a delayed reaction to the violence, to the fear. The skillet slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the wooden planks. Elias turned to her. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and he reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking it behind her ear. It was the most deliberate, personal touch that had ever passed between them. His eyes were full of a deep, quiet awe. "I was scared," she whispered, the admission costing her dearly. "I know," he said, his voice soft. He did not let go. His hand rested for a moment against the side of her face. "You were brave." They went inside, leaving the dust to settle on their victory. The cabin, which had felt so threatened just moments before, was once again their sanctuary. The silence that fell was not empty or tense. It was deep and resonant, the silence of after. It was the silence of two people who had stood together and held their ground. It was the silence of home. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, they sat at the table. The fire crackled in the hearth, a warm and steady heartbeat in the center of the house. He looked at her across the small space, his gray eyes clear. "I never asked," he said softly. "Your name." She had been the girl, the wife, the property. She had been a vessel for the names and intentions of others for so long, she had almost forgotten she had one of her own. To speak it now felt like an act of creation, of claiming the person who had swung the skillet, the person who had said no. "Lena," she said. The name felt strange and new on her own tongue. Elias let the name settle in the quiet air between them. He tested its shape. Lena, he repeated. He said it not as a question, but as a statement, as a fact. In his voice, it sounded like a homecoming. The next morning, they walked out together to the fence line where one of the posts had been knocked askew by Jedediah's horse. Without a word, they began to work. He dug the earth away from the base while she held the post steady. Together, they righted it, tamping the soil back down, firm and secure. They were rebuilding their world, one small, solid piece at a time. The act was a quiet promise. As they worked, she noticed that the small yellow wildflower she had placed on Sarah's grave was gone, carried away by the wind or trampled in the confrontation. Later that day, she found another one, a stubborn purple bloom this time, and placed it by the weathered marker. It was not a replacement. It was a continuation. It was a sign that new life could grow alongside memory, that sorrow did not have to mean emptiness. When Elias saw it later, he gave a slow, understanding nod. The ghosts of the house were finally at peace. The house itself seemed to change. The hollow feeling was gone. It no longer held its breath. It breathed with them, a slow, deep rhythm of life. The sound of her humming a quiet tune as she worked in the garden, the steady chop of his axe at the woodpile, the shared silence by the fire. These things filled the empty spaces, making it whole. They had stitched their lives together with threads of shared work and unspoken kindness, creating a fabric strong enough to withstand the wind. Weeks turned into a season, and the season turned to another. The corn was harvested. The first snows dusted the plains in a coat of white. The world grew quiet and still. One evening, they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the stars prick the vast, black velvet of the sky. The silence between them was no longer a void but a comfortable, shared space, full of everything they understood without needing to say. He had given her a place where she could be safe, and she had given him a reason to fight for it. He had offered her a chance, and she had found the courage to take it. He reached over and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, hers smaller but no less strong. Their fingers interlaced. It was not a gesture of passion, but of deep, abiding companionship. Two solitary souls who had found their anchor in the most unlikely of harbors. On the vast, quiet plain, under the endless canopy of stars, the small cabin glowed with a single point of light, a fragile but defiant testament to the home they had built not from wood and stone, but from the ruins of two broken lives. This story, it ain't just about a man rescuing a woman. In the quiet corners of the world, in the empty spaces left behind by pain, a rescue is never that simple. It's about one person being brave enough to offer a sanctuary, and the other person being brave enough to walk in and build a life inside it. It's about two people creating a space where each of them could, finally, rescue themselves. We all have a name, one that can get lost under the weight of what the world calls us. And the greatest kindness, maybe the only one that truly matters, is to meet someone who asks for that name, and who says it back to you like a prayer. So here's your naming. It's the moment you realize you are not the property of your past. You are not the brand they tried to put on you. You are a choice waiting to be made. And if you're brave, if you're willing to stand on that porch and face down the ghosts, you might just find you're not standing there alone. You might find that the fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash.